everyone. Today we host a session that is probably for the first time at SEEDIG. It is about accessibility. I have a panel of distinguished guests: Andrei, Mare, a student, Erika, Garnier from the Romanian, from the Motivation Romania Foundation, yes, and then two remote participants, Susanna Laurin from Funka, from Sweden, and Amela, Odobašić from the National Regulatory Authority of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But before I start with the session, I have two things to sort out. So the first one is with the youth. The youth, hello. So yesterday you debated what happens if you stay without the internet. Is it anyone amongst you who can summarize the conclusions? Who would like to summarize the conclusions? Yeah, okay, just wait for the microphone.
Thanks. Hello, once more. When we debated what would happen if the internet went down for one day, it was the outcome should have been personal, meaning that what would happen to us? What would we do if the internet went down for one day? The most people, as far as I can remember, answered that one day would not be a problem for them personally. They would go to library, walk around, they may go on an excursion somewhere, have a trip. But when the question was rephrased and reframed in a way that now it's not one day but 1 week, then yes, we have a problem, because otherwise you cannot get the information, you cannot get knowledge that fast, you cannot connect that fast, and that's already a big problem. And of course, I'm not even talking about those who are making a living with the internet and heavily reliant on internet. In that case, yes, they would have a problem within that sphere too, in that field.
Okay, thank you very much. But that can also happen without internet being taken down. So you can come in a situation when you cannot access information, when you cannot access the internet. So today we are going to discuss about accessibility of information, communications, and applications and everything digital. Before I start with the introduction of the participants, I would kindly ask you to go to the Mentimeter and start with the first two questions so that we can get an idea about what are we talking about the understanding of the issue. So, Erika, could you briefly present yourself, please?
Hello. It's working. Okay. Hello, my name is Erika Garnier. I work for Motivation Romania Foundation, which is an NGO which provides services for people with disabilities. We mainly work with wheelchair users, and many of our beneficiaries are people who got into the situation of having a disability during their lifetime. Actually, I was at first a beneficiary of this organization because I got into the situation of using a wheelchair 9 years ago. So at first, I was a beneficiary of their services, and then I stayed as a volunteer. Basically, they couldn't get rid of me anymore, and now I'm part of the team. What we do is provide services for people with disabilities so that they can be independent. So we try to make a shift from I cannot do things to yes, I can do all the things I'm interested in, despite the fact that I'm using a wheelchair and this is not the reality I was used to in the first years of my life. So we have an active rehabilitation program which focuses on independent living for wheelchair users, and it's conducted by a multidisciplinary team including trainers who use wheelchairs. And on this, during this program, we also approach accessibility as the main condition to help people function.
Okay, thank you. My name is Andrei. I'm a medical school student and I have a deficiency of hearing. So that's why I'm wearing two cochlear implants to hear better. What more I should do?
All right, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
And now, Amela and Susanna, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, so Susanna, can you briefly introduce yourself, please?
So I'm Susanna Laurin. I'm an accessibility expert from Sweden. I work for a company called Funka, and I'm doing research and innovation and also a lot of policy work and standardization for the European Commission. I've been in the area of accessibility for longer than you would like to know, more or less my whole life. And Funka is a small consultancy who is doing consultancy in accessibility and a lot of user testing and user outreach. So we were created by the user organizations in Sweden, but we are now a commercial company, and I believe we are the market leaders in this area in Europe.
Okay, thank you. And Amela?
First of all, I would like to say a huge hello to everyone.
Amela, can you speak louder or set your settings louder?
Can you hear me now, Dušan?
No, a bit louder.
Now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better. Can you hear?
It's better. And now? Is it even better now? Okay, can I continue, Dušan? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's still a bit low, but it's better than before. So you can start.
All right. So my name is Amela Odobašić. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina. In my full-time job, I'm head of public affairs of Communications Regulatory Agency, a converged regulatory body and one of the first and the only at the moment in Southeast Europe. Apart from my full-time and hence the interest in the topic of ICT accessibility, I am actively involved in the work of International Telecommunication Union, and in my capacity of Rapporteur of question 7, and that is a question that deals with ICT accessibility for persons with disabilities and other specific needs. Since 2014, I've been really paying special attention to this particular issue, and over the years I've realized that as well as globally, as well as in Southeast Europe, persons with disabilities and other persons with specific needs, or should I say all of us, are facing many problems that should overcome. In that particular respect, I would like to congratulate the organizers for hosting such an important session, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, today we also have the community of members from the Deaf Association of Romania. So, hello. Okay, thank you. Now we pass the first part, the introductory part, and now let's put accessibility into the context so that you understand what are we talking about. So, Erika, could you start, please, with your story and the presentation of accessibility?
So, to begin, why is important accessibility for me? I would start by telling why is accessibility important for me and how is accessibility important for my work. So, as I mentioned before, I think that most of the time the accessibility is the key in people's functioning, and this is quite obvious in my case. So, for example, I have here a ramp which helped me to get on this stage. If I hadn't this ramp here, I wasn't able to be in front of you. Maybe some people in this room couldn't have seen me. So I wouldn't be in a good functioning situation. And the example that I gave relates to physical environment, but this can also be extended to technology. And I have a very nice quote which keeps running around in my mind, so I'll have to tell it now to get rid of it, because I remembered it when you, Dušan, asked the people in the room, the youth group, about their work yesterday and about their experience with not being able to access internet for one day. I guess that I think that was the question. And the quote that that keeps running in my mind is something that a nice lady who worked for the IBM National Center for People with Disabilities said once, and it's that if for the most people technology / accessibility in general makes things easier, for people with disabilities, accessibility / technology make things possible. So I think that's the whole idea of our session today, if I understand it well. And I would point that accessibility is not only what we can see, but many means that help people functioning without us being aware of them. Such as some scripts maybe in technologies, such as magnifiers or functions that the devices that we use have and we are not aware of because we are not used to use them. So the World Health Organization says that 1 in 7 persons has a disability. This means that their estimation goes to 15% of the world's population, which means that disability is not such a strange subject or a subject that goes to that only refers to a small group of people, as we sometimes tend to believe. That's what I used to think before being in a wheelchair. I had no idea about how accessibility could help people. So if we take a look at the number, 15% of the population of the world needs access in order to participate. In order to participate and to be active members of their communities as citizens, as clients of the companies, as members of their families, as, I don't know, passionate about doing things. So all these people need access in order to be part of the community. And there's not only this group of people who are defined as people with disabilities who need access, but if we take a closer look at the people we have around us, we all know elder people who also need access because their natural functions are affected by the age. So the accessibility is not only useful for people who are certified, who have their disabilities certified, but also for people who are aging, and even for people who don't have a certified disability but have some limited functions. I guess I am out of the context a bit.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Okay, thank you very much. Probably one of the issues here, Erika mentioned the percentage. But when we think of the percentage, we have to consider the population also of this area. So we are speaking about, if we are speaking about SEEDIG, which is Southeastern Europe plus the neighboring area, we are speaking about over 200 million people and 15%. But for this area, it's even more, according to the World Health Organization. So we are speaking about over 30 million people who have problems, various disabilities, and that may fall into this category of not having proper access to information or digital technologies. So Andrei, what is your experience?
Okay, thank you, Dušan, and we take Erika because she gave a very broad view on how disabilities view, because for deaf people, they are same problem because I am hard of hearing. That means I'm not totally deaf. I have a very small hearing. It is a less misconception for general populations to speak louder to us. We don't need to you to speak louder because we can see you, we can understand you. You don't have to speak louder, you have to speak clearer. That is. And for example, we have, I think, deaf people or hard of hearing members of here. They can they experience various degree of loss of hearing. And it's exactly the same with the blind people because in general conception of majority, the blind people means they don't see nothing. They see black, for example. And blind people use text-to-speech.
That's something I also wanted to point, that you cannot simply identify a person with its written diagnosis on a piece of paper and assume you know everything about the person, because as you said, there are different variations in functioning, and there are different ways to participate and to I don't know, to solve the issues that you have depending on your personal experience, not only on a diagnosis or a health condition written on a piece of paper. And most of the time people tend to confuse the person with the diagnosis itself or the element that they need to function. So for example, that's just one of an example from my experience. I can stand when you are in a plane and you have to go on board, the assistants then talk about the person as if they're in a wheelchair, which is my experience, as if they would talk about the wheelchair itself. So they say, you should put the wheelchair at the window because it's safer like that. So where's the wheelchair? And I'm like, I am the person in the wheelchair. So there are many situations where people confuse the elements that accompany the person or the diagnosis with the person herself, and that's why sometimes we don't have a large view.
That also adds another perspective. So these definitions are very narrow.
Yes.
While the accessibility issues are much broader. So I think that before can we see the first answer? For the Mentimeter. No, that's. What was that? Yeah. So we can see here that there are people who experience accessibility issues even within this community. So it's not that uncommon. And Susanna, coming to you, you are working as an expert all over Europe and in North America. What is your comment on this, on importance? Why accessibility is important in your perspective?
To me, accessibility is really a human right. It has to do with democracy. Every person and individual, it doesn't matter what kind of abilities you have the right to use information and services, and also, of course, I mean, if we talk about digital, it's really to perceive information, understand information, and then also use the services of the internet and every other digital arena and the channel. In the built environment, of course, there are other things as well, but really it has to do with inclusion and democracy, and that everyone should have the equal opportunities or the equal access. That is really, to me, it's very basic like that, and everything we do is based on the UN CRPD. So I think the human rights perspective is where you should start when you start talking about accessibility. And I mean, we see it much broader, not only for persons with disabilities, but nowadays we work also a lot with migrants. So it has to do with understanding content and understanding languages. So it can be also broadened to other groups and social issues, and for economic reasons, maybe you don't have access to internet. So how do you then get access to the information and so on? So it's a very broad question, but that is where I would start.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, yeah, we used to say that everyone from us will experience accessibility issues once upon in our lifetimes. Yeah, Amela, can you add something?
well, yes, inevitably I would agree with Susan when she says that it's a matter of
We-
human rights.
We don't hear you, Amela.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Dušan?
Yeah, it's better now.
I inevitably agree with Susan when she says that it is a matter of human rights. And it is, as well as with you when you stated that it is that accessibility should be looked within a very broad concept. I would just like to refer to the famous 3 A's, and that is the digital technology should be accessible, available and affordable, and for all. And as Susan said, I mean, we shouldn't really limit this particular topic to persons with disabilities, because with the we see that other groups with specific needs simply new groups are emerging on a daily basis. But let me just reflect and elaborate briefly on the 3 A's. Availability. What is availability? Availability means actually that connectivity should be provided, and connectivity of not only urban areas but also rural and remote areas. And in that way, connectivity is going to enable access to information and knowledge to disadvantaged segments of society. Accessibility, accessible information within the international framework and then standards and good practices. Accessibility is looked at first of all, it involves different stakeholders, ranging from policy and legal and policy and regulatory framework. Then accessibility of information is also looked at within TV accessibility, within mobile accessibility, web accessibility, public procurement. If we have time during this panel, maybe I can just refer to each of these specific points that I've raised. And the third segment is affordability, because the digital technology should be affordable, so not only available and accessible, but also affordable to all, and leaving no one behind. So when we speak of the international practices in Europe in particular, the situation is very interesting, because there is a big gap between the status of accessible ICTs between the developed and developing countries. You see, in most of the developed countries, accessible digital technologies, accessible ICTs, they're present. They're up to 100, well, between 90 and 100%. You know, the accessibility is present, and it's really the population that is in need of accessible ICTs is not even thinking about that. On the contrary, in many developing countries, and in particular, I can for sure say for the countries of the Western Balkans, the accessible ICTs are below 2%, you see, and this is a very alarming fact, which means that particular attention should be paid by the government, by the policymakers to start with, and to really focus on the implementation of the available TV resources. And we are happy that in Europe there are many that could be replicated in the developing countries. And I will stop here now on this particular point.
Okay, thank you, Amela. You already opened the third question that you wanted to discuss. So now I would like to ask you, the audience, to go to the second question in Mentimeter. Yeah, Susanna, Amela already started with this regional and international perspective. So we are a very diverse region. We have 5 EU member states, then some accession countries, and countries that are not associated with European processes. So for some countries, the EU directives apply. For some, will apply when they join. All countries ratified, or most of the countries ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But now the question is, from your perspective, for example, from the European perspective, what can we do in the region? Because we cannot go ahead with the legislation which is adopted at the EU level. So what are the plans for the countries that have already joined, that are members of the EU, those who are joining, and for the rest who are not on this path yet? Can you frame this European perspective and your experience, because you are also working, consulting the EU on certain issues?
So I think one of the key issues, or I'm thinking two things really. The reason that we are now succeeding in getting harmonized requirements for accessibility and also legislation in Europe is that we moved the whole issue from the social area into the financial area. And that is when the legal stuff really started happening. So now we have procurement directive with requirements for accessibility when you procure things in public sector. And then we have the web accessibility directive that covers the public sector. All the websites and documents and apps and intranets and extranets need to be accessible in public sector. And now just a couple of weeks ago, the Council approved the European Accessibility Act, which is a similar regulation covering also some of the private sector. And really, I think what other countries can do that doesn't want to copy exactly what the EU does, but still want to move ahead with accessibility is maybe not so much look at the legal part of it, but the policy side. Because really what made this happen is the EN standard. There is a European standard called EN 301549, which is really accessibility requirements for products and services within ICT. And that standard can be used by anyone. You don't need to connect it into some legal framework, but you can use the standard as a minimum standard for everything you do. And any country can work with that. I've been helping the Australian government to implement the standard, and also in Mexico I have been working with the Mexican government implementing the standard. So that is really free of charge. It doesn't cost anything, and you can use it, and it also makes it easier for the companies. I'm sure there are a lot of trade between your countries that would also benefit from having harmonized requirements in accessibility, so that the ICT companies can sell cross borders with the same regulations. Because if you have EU countries who need to comply with the Web Accessibility Directive, then ICT companies that want to sell to public sector, because public sector usually has a lot of money, so that they are good clients for an ICT generalist company, and they can then choose if they want to have one set of services and products that are accessible so that it can work in the EU. But if they also want to sell outside the EU, then it would be stupid to have two different versions of your product. It's easier to have just one. So my hope is that when we move forward with this within the European Union, that will also sort of spill over to the countries outside of the EU, and hopefully make it easier also for other countries that would like to follow in the footsteps of EU to use the same standard. And that's why we will have sort of a minimum baseline requirements for accessibility in the ICT arena, spreading far longer than or far beyond the borders of the EU. That is already happening, and I would think that it would be also possible in your neighboring countries that are just outside the EU but still have a lot of things in common with the EU. So that would be my hope and wish. And if there's anything I can do or we can do from the policy perspective to help that happen, we would be more than happy to. There are loads of training programs and tools and ways of sort of getting started with using the EN standard that we would be happy to share with you.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, that's very optimistic. And yes, I agree with you that companies cannot produce stuff for different markets, although they do, sometimes they do this. But in the ICT area, that's not so common. So the biggest companies are investing heavily in accessibility. Well, as SEEDIG is about a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and we have these stakeholders defined like governments, the civil society, the businesses, the academia, the technical community. What is your perspective about key stakeholders in improving accessibility?
Well, according to research we have done on behalf of the European Commission, that is the 4 pillars that needs to be in place to be able to succeed with accessibility. Really, that is, it's exactly what you say. It's the public sector needs to be there. They need to have the demand side, so they need to provide demands when they do procurement, and then there needs to be an industry who could answer to these demands. So you need the businesses as well. You need the academy to do the research to make sure that you really have that the solutions work in a sustainable way and that you have a methodology for developing things. And of course the end users are the core of everything, because everything we do is because of the end user and for the end users. So everything needs to be co-created together with end users and controlled together with end users, so that they are tested by the people who are really using the services. So I think with these 4 pillars, you can do whatever you like in accessibility. But I would always start with the demand side. You can never move private sector before they have a reason to move, and that necessarily doesn't have to be a law, but it needs to be some kind of demand. So somebody needs to make it clear that we will only buy this from you if it is accessible. And in many of the EU countries, we did not have a law until now, and still many of the countries without legislation have been very successful in accessibility just by the collaboration between these 4 parties or stakeholders in society. For example, in the Nordic countries, we haven't had legislation until now, and Sweden and the UK, and I mean many other countries who have been working without a real technical specification or a technical law has still been very successful in accessibility. And some countries within the EU that has had legislation before, they were not very successful. I will not mention any, but there are differences there. So the legislation is not sort of the sole key, the sole tool, but really working with the demand side and then making these 4 stakeholder groups work together. I think that is really a key issue. And then basing it on the harmonized standard, I would say.
So can you mention some good examples of multi-stakeholder cooperation in this, cooperation with governments in the area of procurement, for example?
Well, we do a lot of co-creation work, and also the European Commission is also funding quite a lot of research and innovation projects like this. So there are several good examples in health, for example. There is a European partnership on innovation in digital health, where more than 400 stakeholders go together and work in action groups. That we have been leading that project for 5 years, I think. So within the active and healthy aging and health and welfare tech. So that there are many really interesting examples from when the demand also comes from the user side, and then the industry is trying to solve the problem. The procurers is sort of doing the financing of it, and then the academy is doing the methodology. So there are loads of good examples around that. And also in the Nordic countries, we do a lot of work with the municipalities. So all the social services and municipalities is also set up the same way, so that we know that we are inclusive in the way we are producing the solutions, and also always working with a scientific methodology, and then inviting also the private stakeholders to this. We have a network for this around municipality services. So there are also plenty of good examples there, and I think also in smart cities there are also really good examples from stakeholder involvement in a very sort of strategic way.
Okay, that's.
There needs to be funding, though. It doesn't sort of appear by itself. Somebody needs to come up with the first bunch of cash, because end users needs to get paid when they work, because the end users are the experts, and the industry needs to know that there is money somewhere or another, and the academy. So there's the budget needs to be there in the start when you start something like that.
Yeah, that's also very important. Thank you for these ideas for SEEDIG, because we are sometimes lacking these key stakeholders, like governments and municipalities. We have them only on this high-level policy discussions regarding internet, but there are also other issues where they should be more involved. So if now, well, it's only 25 answers. Can you do more? Can you log in to the Menti site and but it is indicative. So the level of accessibility in the region is not very high, but still there are some countries, according to these statistics, to these answers that that have an appropriate level of accessibility. And which are these countries? Well, the answers were anonymous, but still, which are these countries where the level of accessibility is appropriate? Okay. In Greece. Sorry, are you going to answer? Or? No. No? Okay, sorry. I was waiting for the answer.
I think that it depends on who judges what appropriate means.
Yeah.
Because what it is appropriate and accessible for one person may be not at all accessible for another person with or without a disability. I mean, I'm talking about persons in general.
That was a too general question probably, yes, and it's rather personal, I agree. So now here we go. Well, we want to make good showcases, and we'd like to present some examples of how this technology works and how assistive technologies also work. And I would like to ask Erika to present one example of the assistive technology that can improve accessibility.
Yeah, so during the last years, we try to focus more on accessibility, and on accessibility not only on a physical level, but also on digital technologies as far as we understand them and as we know how to include them in our programs. And because we work mainly with people with mobility disabilities, with the support of our partners from Vodafone Romania Foundation, we managed to promote and to introduce in Romania an app. You may say it's not something very sophisticated, but it's really an application that can make the shift from I cannot to yes I can for many people that we work with. It is called Eva Facial Mouse, and is an application that puts a mouse on your phone and allows you to write messages and to use your phone in general only by moving your head and your eyes. And this is really, really important for people who have their mobility affected and their coordination both in their arms and in their legs, and people who have spinal cord injuries or other types of diagnosis which give this type of impairments. And we tested it with some of our friends who are quadriplegics and who really had a tough time trying to communicate with their friends or, I don't know, to use their phones, which at first it seems a very simple action, but when you have parts of your body affected, it can be a real challenge to send a text message. Of course, there are various solutions for this, and each of the solution is appropriate for one person or for another, but we found this to be very effective in terms of giving back independence and intimacy, because for example, one of our friends who tested it used to ask his mother to text for him. And maybe you just don't feel like sharing the message with your friend, your mother, your sister, or I don't know who else. You just need to have a personal communication with somebody. So this Eva facial mouse is a very effective way for people who have their mobility affected to use their phones, to do such a simple thing as using their phones for personal reasons, or I don't know, for work or whatever they may need to use their phones for. We have a short video on that.
Yes, Haris, can you show the video, please?
Which shows exactly how the
Eu dacă sunt de atâta timp în scaunul rulant și am probleme cu mâinile, nu mă descurc singur, nu mișc degetele deloc, mie pe telefonul meu este mult mai greu să scriu un SMS sau pe Facebook sau mesaje în general. Scriu 2-3 litere, a patra o scriu greșit. Iar trebuie să șterg, iar apăs cu degetul unde nu trebuie și ca să scriu câteva cuvinte îmi ia 10 minute, să zici. Mai rău mă enervez și m-am lăsat pe gubaș.
Some brief mentions. You can put the phone on mute so the letters are not heard, and which gets me back to intimacy. This guy in the video had a swimming accident. I mean, he was in a competition with his brother of who can go on a longer distance underwater, and that's why he got in this situation, which brings me back to our discussion about how out of our reality disability is. And the phone, and you should give access to the camera in order to use the application. This is, for me, Eva facial mouse and how it works, and this guy's story are the exact representation of the quote that I said earlier, that maybe for some people technology is just there to make things easier, but for him, for example, this app makes things possible. I mean, it makes him possible for him to write a text.
Okay, thank you. Andrei, can you add something here? A good example, for example, from your own experience?
Okay, yes, I can give you some examples. For example, me and Dušan, we had to talk at phone prior to this conference, and I have a problem to understand him clearly, and that I had to ask him to talk on WhatsApp. This is one problem we face. Another problem we face is that the national news broadcasting on TV. Sometimes I can understand because the sound is clear, but when the reporters are outside and they talk at the microphone, I don't only hear the reporter voice, but I hear the surrounding voices, so I can hear perfectly what the reporter is saying. And some years ago, the national broadcaster channel had an option to enable via teletext to enable captions for the news. And I found it very useful for us. But for now, it's not anymore possible. Another experience is YouTube. We use YouTube a lot, and we love when the clips have closed captions, because if they have closed captions, we can simultaneously listen and read the description, and we have full access to the information. So for a lot of time when I see a YouTube without captioning, I will have to concentrate harder to understand the information, and it frustrates me. So I will wait a lot more time I will wait for the captioning to be available, so I have to wait in the most cases. And but I love that HBO and Netflix, the streaming applications, they have a closed caption, especially for hard of hearing. Because if you have Netflix, please choose the closed caption in English. Because if you see the closed caption in English, you don't have only the description. You have a description of what the surrounding voice are, like the creaking door, car passing. So it immerses us in the experience of the movie or the show. That's the same for the blind people, because the blind people have only for Netflix, not for HBO. They have on the Netflix, they have audio description of the movie, so they can hear also the voices and operate the description of this journey, the face. And I like this example of good practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Amela, are you still with us?
Yes, I am still with you, and hope you can hear me well. I would like to refer to a few points raised. It is a very interesting statement have been said. So if you allow me, I would first refer to what Susanna had said about the EU legislation and regarding disability, which is really a positive thing. For us, the countries, the developing countries, although we are not EU members, still we hope that in the accession process, the pre-accession process, we do need to carry out harmonization in all areas, including, hopefully, accessibility. The problem is that accessibility is not positioned, is not the top priority on the agenda of the government, and that needs to be changed. The biggest problem in our countries is the lack of knowledge. I have never experienced that whenever I turn to be a government representative, and I work with the regulatory authorities in several countries in South Eastern European region, that they said and then raised the issue of accessibility, none of them turned back to me and they said, no, we don't want to do that. Okay. And they said, oh, we really haven't thought about it. Because what they do, they ratify the convention, they even harmonize national legislation, regulatory framework with it, but they don't implement it. Indeed, that's the problem. So it's raising awareness, increasing capacity building on the need on having ICTs accessible for all are crucial. And it's also just important to change the narrative, you see. Maybe we should start thinking, because we are talking about digital transformation, we are talking about digital inclusion, see. Maybe we should stop segmenting different categories, such as persons with disabilities, gender, women and youth, and indigenous, and etc. But we should really, or age-related disabilities that are really increasing, but we should really start by changing the narrative. We should put like move a step forward. So I would like to point out that what is very important is collaboration. And Susanna was right when she said that we cannot simply copy-paste good practices, and there are some excellent practices that are applicable to the developed countries, but we can definitely take many of them and we should tailor them to our national circumstances. And that is why I believe, this is my personal view, that in Europe we are really blessed, so to speak, that there are so many good examples that we can simply rely on. And what is also crucial, what I find, is empowering persons with disabilities in putting the issue of ICT accessibility on government agenda, because government can, as well as regulatory authorities, they can play a central role in improving the current situation. They can update the legislation, promote ICT accessibility, but also they, as Susanna was rightly pointing out, especially the government, they could create a market for accessible ICT, for example, by adopting accessible public procurement policies. And then when the government buys accessible ICTs, manufacturers and service providers respond by developing accessible ICTs. And they don't want to lose the lucrative business opportunities of selling ICTs to the government to start with. So the government are important factors in moving this, in improving the situation in this particular area. And also, it was really encouraging to see some good practices when it comes to technological solutions and innovation in ICT accessibility. And I would like to use this opportunity to really bring to your attention this platform of Accessible Europe. That is a joint initiative or partnership by International Telecommunication Union and European Commission. And the first Accessible Europe was held last year in December in Vienna, and we've experienced really an amazing platform for exchange of views, practices, and innovative solutions. And so I will not really take time to talk about Accessible Europe, but I was just bringing to your attention, visited, there is a website available, and you can get all the necessary information, and if there are any, especially the innovative solutions should be promoted, and there is also a competition that is going to be organized again. So you know, by joining forces with a collaborative approach, I really believe that we can do a lot. And as I said, I think it's encouraging that we have experts such as Susanna and her colleagues, and definitely the good practices and you know, must be replicated in the countries such as developing countries.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Amela. We had problems here on stage with hearing, at least me, and I guess Andrei as well. But yes, you came up with a very good overview of the situation and issues, and I think that we can work later on and also after the SEEDIG meeting here in Bucharest on the issues together. So let's ask now the audience, are there any good practices in the region? I know that there are some initiatives, well, in all countries, but some developments in Georgia, Armenia, also not only in Southeastern Europe. Is there anyone here present to present good practices?
Hello? There we go. Yeah. I don't know if this is really a good practice, but I guess it was the only way to get the attention. So we have a case, interesting, coming from Georgia, where a local NGO is suing the government for not making one of the services available online. This is a case of Ministry of Health being sued by visually impaired NGO for not making their website accessible. So it's an ongoing case right now. There's no solution so far, but they're trying to make a case that how important that is. So they're not really asking for any financial retribution, but they want to make sure that the products that the government procures, meaning digital services, websites and mobile applications, have to be accessible and have to oblige by some standards. The case becomes complicated because we don't really have any standards set at the moment. There's international standards from W3C, but there's nothing local that adapts to our legislature. So that work still has to be done within the country. So at the moment, this case right now is probably a first step towards just raising awareness as to how important that is for the country to take that first step, and then eventually we'll probably grow into some solutions that will be integrated into public services.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's also one of the approaches, the hard approach, that was taken probably 20, 30 years ago in the United States. They have now a very advanced legislation, but most cases were won in courts. Also in some other countries, but in Europe we are trying to not enforce, but to promote this through legislation, and also, of course, sometimes through enforcement. And procurement is one way of doing this. And you don't need, as Susanna mentioned before, you don't need really international standards. You can just adopt it. You can just follow the examples and implement standards probably in the procurement process or also in other areas. Would you like to comment, Susanna, from your experience?
Yes, I'm curious how you sue someone for lack of accessibility if you don't have a viable standard attached to the legislation. How will the legislator know if this is, I mean, what are you complying to or not complying to if you don't have a standard? I don't see how that can work legally.
Yeah, I agree. We also discussed that in Slovenia, but the problem is that if you don't have a standard or some norms in subsidiary legislation at least, then it's difficult for the judges to decide.
Exactly.
So the principles are known, are in our legislations, in human rights conventions, but when you come to court, it's difficult because the judges can decide on principles, but then the other steps are very difficult, and that depends also on the countries. But in the United States, I know that people just went to courts and they won cases. But there are also other examples, you know, how email developed. Oh, sorry, there is a question. Okay.
Not a question, but an example. From Turkey. In 2017 and 2018, we hosted one of a disabled NGO's president at Youth IGF Turkey, and what they did was, their NGO is called Education. It's for virtually disabled people. I'm sorry, now I'm talking Turkish English, but in education. And so they campaigned for blind students to be able to take the university exam test because, well, the university exam test for foreign languages, and until a few years ago they weren't able to because the test would only be available in the regular form, so they wouldn't be able to take it in audio or print it out in the Braille alphabet. So the NGO was campaigned for it, and they finally got the attention of the ministry, and now for the last few years the test is available for blind students as well. So that's a good example, but it's also an example of almost an individual effort, but it shows how much big of a difference can an NGO make for the students in the entire country.
Okay, thank you.
Also in Greece, the websites of the public service systems, platforms like for your taxes and every other thing, as well as municipality websites, needs to be accessible to these people, and they have accessibility features. Not all of them, but most of them have been transformed, and the others are in the process of transforming.
Oh, that's great. Have you implemented the standards before the European directive was?
I think was after the European directive or a bit before.
But so you were so quick in the implementation, or?
No, that was because the work had started before and was some like cooperation between all the sectors.
Yeah, that's great. So before we continue, I ask you to fill in the last question in Mentimeter. And so I think that we can now start here with the user involvement. I listened when preparing for this session some panels in Silicon Valley where these big companies are promoting accessibility, and they're saying that it is very important to involve users. And Susanna also mentioned before the involvement of users, and now Haris also mentioned that it is important to cooperate. So Susanna, what is your experience in Europe with the involvement of users? Because you mentioned before that you are working for the European Commission and other governments, but are they also cooperating with users, or are users only involved in the cooperation with companies that develop new technologies?
So I must say that is one of the things that I'm most proud of, that I have gotten through in the Implementation Act of the Web Accessibility Directive, that it is actually stated now in the legal text that users should be included. That was on its way out of the legislation a couple of times, but not only me, but many others also fought for it, but it's actually my words in the text. So it is now legally required that the end users are included when you work with the monitoring of the Web Accessibility Directive. So all the national member states have an old national monitoring body who is overseeing the compliance of the directive. And it says in Article 4 that they need to 7 that they need to include the end users when they choose which sectors to first of all monitor, and so that the services and information and websites that are tested for accessibility are the ones that are most relevant for end users. And also in the legislation we have defined the different user groups that you need to test accessibility for, so that there's not only tested for the compliance of a standard, but also that you actually cover the different user groups. So there is a very clear connection to the user requirements and the user involvement in the legislation. I think many, if not most, of the European countries, there are user involvement in different levels, but there are, as you know, different cultures and tradition, and so it's a big difference between north and south and east and west on how we do things. But I think the user involvement is growing, which is really encouraging for me. And there is more and more research being done. I think the academy, the scientific part of society, the universities are really a driving force for really testing things in real life, because otherwise I don't see why we are working with accessibility if we are not basing it on the real user needs. So to me, users need to be involved in everything, and we are actually also working together with end user organizations with some kind of manifesto that states that the users should always be paid, and they must be treated in a good way, and they should be sort of not only they should be involved from the beginning and not only in the end, and so on. So there are a lot of good practices in how to do this, but if you go down to the real day-to-day work, I think unfortunately many persons with disabilities are unemployed, and not many of our clients have really persons with disabilities in their workforce, and that means that every time you need to test something with a person with a disability, you need to go externally. You can call us or someone else, but I mean that is a cost, and it is also kind of a threshold when you do, kind of a barrier when you need to go externally to do it. So for me, one key issue to get more user involvement is really to work with the labor market so that persons with disabilities can be also included in the workforce. And when you have colleagues that have a disability, then it's much easier for you to understand that we really need to make this accessible because my friend here cannot hear or see or whatever. So it becomes a natural way of your daily life, so to speak, your daily business. So it might sound like a detour, but I think it's essential to think about also employment when you talk about accessibility, because really that it goes together in a very nice way, and really you can have sort of testing for free if you have a person in the workforce that has a disability. That is really, it's an enormous power of these people to be included if they are let in the teams.
Yeah, you raised a very important issue. We are speaking about diversity and inclusion, but persons with disabilities are not really included enough in the workforce. So we have one more question. A comment, okay.
A comment, actually. I would just like to add that also we have to raise awareness. No, we all have to raise our awareness, especially the content creators. As Andrei mentioned about YouTube and the means of entertainment, when someone creates a YouTube video, they should also think adding subtitles or some other means. So content creators, please maybe raise your awareness.
Okay, thank you. And I think, Erika, that you have also some cooperation experience in your association in cooperating with, I think, with another foundation. Were you involved in testing or the implementation?
Yes, no, we actually try to be, I think that the key is to be more present for the persons with disabilities, to be more present and to make people aware of their needs. It's kind of a vicious circle if you think a bit, because most of the time people with disabilities would like to be more present, but they don't have the means to be more present in the community life. But somehow this is still the key, to be more present. And if you already mentioned the American legislation, I would say that another quote is nothing for us or about us without us. So involving the users in policy making is really essential. I would say that we go in this direction with motivation. Not only work with other foundations in order to put together projects that would set best practice examples, which maybe hopefully will be adapted. That's what we think in the beginning of each project, that it would be a successful project, and maybe the state will do it on a macro level. But we also work with representatives of the government, and I would say, as Susanna said, from my point of view, it's a growing number of people with disabilities involved in policy making and in those round tables and in the development of strategies for people with disabilities in the during the last years. And I think that's not only because of the legislation, but because maybe the society became or becomes more aware of the presence of people with disabilities, which are sometimes undercover because there may be invisible disabilities, and maybe the people you travel with to work in the while using the subway, for example, and the people you greet on the street or you meet at the office are people with disabilities that you don't even know that are in this category of people with disabilities. So I think that it's very important to have action groups and people with disabilities involved, and I think that sometimes we ask ourselves to be involved if nobody else from the project comes and asks us.
That's true. But what Susanna also mentioned was that they should be more involved.
Yes.
In testing, in the development phase.
Yes, exactly. Phase. In the development, in the creating, and in the creation of the services or products, and in their testing, because I wouldn't see how other way it would be really, the result would be really useful if not tested by the person who will really use it. And just to see exactly what are the limits and what should be improved. And I go back to Eva Facial Mouse, this app that I mentioned, and we focused on how people will move their head and how they will, when we tested in our small group, I mean, we focused on how the app will work and how people will move their head and their eyes, and everything will be nice and beautiful, and they will be able to write text messages again. But at first I tested, Alex tested it, and one of our quadriplegic friends, which is really active and independent, and who can hold his phone and look at the application and move his head. But when we tested with people with different level of functioning, we got to the idea that we need to develop a device which simply holds in a fixed position the phone, because the person won't be able to hold the phone because of the limited movement in fingers and because of the balance also. So it's really, really important to test all the aspects with the user and see which are the limits of the result, because however, whatever will be designed will be useful for a part of the population, and we will need more features to be good for another type of, I mean, for persons with different needs in functioning and so on. So yes, I think it's critical, it's essential to have users involved in testing a ramp, an application, whatever.
Okay, thank you. Susanna, you mentioned before that you don't have enough time to finish this session until 4, or can you still wait a bit?
Sorry,
can you be with us?
No problem.
We have one online participant, is Suada from Bosnia Herzegovina, from Communications Regulatory Authority of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And she says, the first ever European standard on accessible ICTs titled Accessibility Requirements Suitable for Public Procurement of ICT Products and Services in Europe was published in March 2014. However, the 2014 Public Procurement Directive does not explicitly require procuring authorities in member states to use these standards. Therefore, the European standard for accessible ICTs remains strictly a voluntary measure. I would like to ask you to discuss this issue. Do you know the status of the implementations, and do we have some data?
Susanna, I think this is addressed to you. Can you answer?
Yes, I think so. So it is true that the procurement directive doesn't point specifically to the EN standard, but it is a big shift. In 2017, the legislation showed changed in all the European member states. Before, the 7th chapter said that when ICT is procured, when it's possible, you should take into account people with disabilities, which means that you can do it, but nothing will happen if you don't do it. So it was a very, very soft recommendation. But after the 1st of January 2017, the wording was changed into when the procured is going to be used by humans, meaning not machine to machine, but when the interface is going to be used by humans, you shall take persons with disabilities into account. So it's a very big shift, and then there is no connection to the specific legislation, but this means that it is no longer optional. You shall take this into account. So, and we have seen an enormous shift in how procurements are being written now in Western Europe that really, I mean, I don't say that everyone is procuring the right way, but really everything that is above the threshold is almost mentioning at least accessibility. Then you can always say that they should have done it better and more specific and so on, but there is really a really big shift in how the demand side is working. So the procurement directive to me is really working very well, and it is also a very strong enforcement mechanism in that now the web accessibility directive has entered into force. And please do not refer to the 2014 version of this standard, because it is updated. So the current version is what is now in place from August last year. So that is the accessibility requirement. It's the same standard, but it is updated since 2014. So now we should use the harmonized one that is also harmonized with the US, and that was published on the 31st of August last year, 2018. So that is now the provision that should be applied in the Web Accessibility Directive. Also, the scope of the standard was broadened. It is true that it was written first to cover procurement only, but because of the Web Accessibility Directive, the new name of the standard is now Accessibility Requirements for Products and Services in ICT. The procurement part is taken out because now it has a much broader coverage. And if you're interested in the standard, we are now just a couple of weeks from now, we are updating to the next version. So this is a living document, and it will be continuing to evolve over the years to also cover more of the cognitive issues. And we are constantly working. I'm one of the experts in the special task force for this. So we are developing the standard. It takes time, I know, but it is still evolving, and it will be even better. And I mean, now it is the best we have. So to the Georgian person who was speaking before, I would say my recommendation would be, if you need to have national standards, then look at the European standard. Do not look at the US ones, but look at the European ones, because that one has a much broader coverage worldwide. And it is also now connected into legislation in different parts, and it's also completely harmonized with the US. So if you have the European standard, you can also sell things in the US, but the other way around is much more difficult. So the EN standard is really, would be my suggestion if you need to do something new. And you can do as they did it in Australia. They skipped the whole working phase because they thought that if the whole of EU and US and Canada has been working together in 11 years with this standard, then probably it's okay. You know, we have been doing this with all the stakeholders in many countries during 11 years. So probably it's a kind of a okay standard. So they just adopted it, which is a very smooth process, and you don't need to invest a lot of time and money in it. And then at least you have a national standard of your own very quickly. You can just use the one in the EU. That is very. It's a common way to do if you don't have the resources to develop a standard of your own. And I also think in ICT, really, we have no borders, and the companies and services, they are flying all over the world. So why wouldn't we share the common standard instead of inventing new ones? I think the harmonization is really important, because if we fragmentize the market, then all the industries will have different, all sorts of problems with the buying and selling things over the borders. So a common standard is really of help for everyone, and especially for the industry.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's also very important for the region, because there is no need to develop their own standards in the countries. So we are now approaching 1 hour and a half of the session. I suggest that we start wrapping up. Can we combine, let's say, the final thoughts and the way forward, so that the final thoughts are forward-looking? Can we start with you, Andrei?
I can add one more point for developers who my concern, because the United Nations is a convention of rights for people with disabilities, and here are some states that special need persons have rights to information, and here is some points where you can adapt your policy to include the person with disabilities, and I can see that is a very easy to understand the rights because it's international, and I think that countries from East Europe, I don't think that they all have the ratified, but it's a good start to understand the rights because it's a universal, until from universal view is adapted to national and local governments. And it's more easy to adapt the needs to the person with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Erika?
I think that the key to success is that we focus more on the idea that we are all ordinary people and that we should all have the right to do and to do the same things with dignity. And I know that there are policymakers there and there are representatives of the companies who can change things for the better because they are in decision positions. But besides their role as I don't know, CEOs or policymakers or things like that, they are human, and I'm sure that by the time they will realize that in their group of very intimate friends there are lots of people who need accessibility to work, to function, things maybe will change for the better. Until then, what we should do on our side as, I don't know, we are representatives of the civil society, and somehow representatives of people with mobility disabilities, we at Motivation Romania Foundation, because these are the needs that we know better. And what we can do is to show the others our abilities and to make them, to help them understand that it's not only bad for us as individuals with disabilities, but also for the society, for the community to not make its best to take advantage of the resources that we have. Because as I said in the beginning, people with disabilities are able to do a lot of things, to work, to go to school, because we talked about access to work, but we also need access to education. We can do things and be productive and be clients of the companies, and I don't know, we can be present in the right environment so we can function, and that's it. We just need the context to show that this is possible, the environment which allows us to do whatever we want to do.
Okay, thank you. So before the second half of the conclusions, we have only 12 answers for the actions recommended, but we can see that that awareness raising and multi-stakeholder approach are two the most with most answers. Then there are class actions and advocating for better accessibility. So you don't believe in advocating for better accessibility, but you follow the work and example of SEEDIG with a multi-stakeholder approach and awareness raising. Yeah, so these two answers now are getting stronger. Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other comment from the audience, the final comment from the audience? So if not, then Amela, are you still with us?
Yes, Dušan, I'm still with you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's better now, I think. Could you proceed with the final remarks and reflections also possibly, probably?
I will be very brief. In the beginning, beginning, I started with pointing out the importance of 3 A's, and that is digital technologies being available, accessible and affordable. And I will conclude with stressing the importance of having in place the 3 I's, and that is ensuring innovation, involvement and implementation are combined and applied in the process of ensuring the digital inclusion and inclusion for all. At the end, I would just set out the importance. Also, because we are all learning, so and we agreed that there is going to be a lot of work outside of the SEEDIG platform. I congratulate the organizers. This was a wonderful opportunity for the topics to be open, and definitely we should continue in that direction. But also, since we are all learning, I would like to bring to your attention also the importance that in future all the meetings that are organized, regardless of the topic, should be also accessible for all, for persons with disabilities, for persons with other specific needs, which means that the captioning should be provided, or at least the sign language. So this is something, when we're speaking of international standards, this is something that maybe some other people would point out in a little bit more direct way than I'm doing. But don't forget that we are not doing a favor to persons with disabilities. That let's go to the beginning, what Susanna said, that we are talking about human rights, and let's all join forces and work together in really making the whole environment a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amela and Susanna.
So let me first. Oh, I hear myself with an echo. That's not very nice. But I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to meet with you online, even if it's only online. And I would like to say that because I'm not there with you, I hope that any one of you that would like to join us in our research and innovation projects will reach out to me afterwards, because it would be really interesting for us to also do more user research and try to push for innovation also in countries where we have no presence at this time. So please do reach out if you're more interested in what we are doing. I'm sure we can do things together. So I'm a bit worried always when a lot of discussions in immature markets is based on legal issues, because even if now the EU is really working towards legislation, and I do believe in some of it because I think the enforcement mechanisms are really clever. I work enough in North America to know that the legal issues are not the solutions to everything, and believe me, you don't want to go in the direction of the US where everyone is suing each other. And really the majority of the lawsuits in the US is not being the result is not that anything is being better. Most of the lawsuits ends up with somebody earning a lot of money, but really the website is left as inaccessible as it was when the lawsuit started. So that is not a good way to go. So don't go that way, whatever you do. You need something else. The legal framework can be very useful in some ways, but it won't solve the problem. You need more than just the law. And I think the stakeholder involvement and the cooperations and policy, I mean, we have been touching all these subjects, so I think that the ideas are already there. So my sort of message for the future for your region, I think, would be really forward-leaning. Try to make sure that web accessibility competence is taught at the universities, so that it's a natural part of the curricula when you study ICT or design or content or whatever it is, so that the next generation professionals in your countries already have this in their DNA. So it's a natural thing. They always think about accessibility just as they think of the budget or updating their programs or whatever. If you build it into their daily life, then the accessibility will come more or less automatically in the future. So that would be my suggestion for a forward-leaning idea of how to succeed in the future. And good luck.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Thank you for joining us online. Unfortunately, you were not able to join us here in Bucharest, but your contribution, the final contribution, was also very forward-looking, very optimistic and also in line with the values of SEEDIG. So I think that the cooperation is one of the ways forward. And I would like to thank you also to Andrei and Erika for joining us, for taking your time, and to Amela, who contributed to the work of the program committee and to this session. And of course, thank you for the audience for your involvement and contribution during the discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you for bringing this on the agenda.